in terms of process, let me just outline so everybody's clear what I intend to do, and if anyone disagrees with it, I urge you to speak up. I've talked to a number of the states in the Mid-Atlantic states about dealing with the next issue, which is the issue of de minimis. And so what I'd like to do, the sequence of the discussion this morning, I'd like to have a discussion of de minimis, resolve that issue, and then move to item issue 1, which is the goal for the action, and then deal with issue 2. And then following that, if we can manage to get through that, then I want to deal with issue 4. And as I indicated yesterday, I want to package issue 4 with the concerns that were voiced by particularly Area 4 about the closed season. I think these are all the same issues and discussions, so a resolution on issue 4 hopefully will resolve the issue for in the concerns in Area 4 and 5. Any concerns about that strategy? If not, Megan, I see no hands up, so Megan, could you outline the issue on issue 7?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. So just a reminder for the de minimis issue, the question here is whether de minimis states, which are currently Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, have to implement the management measures in this addendum. So option A, de minimis states must implement all management measures adopted under Addendum 25. And option B, the de minimis states are exempt from the Addendum 25 management measures if they meet certain criteria. And the intent of this is to try and make sure that effort from non-de minimis states doesn't move into these de minimis states.
Any questions on that? Yeah, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not so much a question as a comment. When our states proposed this, we expected that de minimis would apply to our lobstermen fishing in federal waters also, which is pretty much where all our landings come from. I had extensive email question and answer with Peter Burns and Megan since the last meeting, and realized that that's not the case, that these de minimis provisions would not apply to our fishermen fishing in federal waters. So in that case, de minimis really is not going to be much of a help in our state. So I just wanted to clarify that for the board.
So Johnny's saying you support option 1?
Given what the status right now, I would say that there's really not really any difference. So that option 1 would probably work, option A.
All right.
Thank you.
Mike, did you have your hand up? You want to speak to this? No? Any other Mid-Atlantic states want to speak to this before Mike?
No, I just agree with John. You know, there was a lot of work that went into crafting this, but through the conversations we realized this really can't offset or help us in any way, given that we don't have state waters fisheries. So John, I don't know if you, with that, was that in the form of a motion? I'd second it for you.
In that case, yes, I would move that the board accept option A for de minimis. Thank you.
I've seconded by Mike. Yeah, it's issue 1. Yeah, but excuse me. So let me suggest, so the record's clear, the motion I think should read, move to approve option 1 in issue 7. Is that correct, John? Is that what your intent is? Option 1 under issue 7.
Option A.
Okay. close the lobster fishery?
I'll just get interject. This is my fault. It says option A on the presentation and option 1 in the document, so they are the same thing. My apologies.
Make it 1A.
Now I understand why I'm confused. Okay, so discussion on that motion. Everyone clear on what the motion is? Anyone at the table care to speak to the motion? No hands up? I think this is a pretty clear issue, fairly easy to resolve. Do the members need a caucus on this? Any members need a caucus? No hands up? Let me ask, since we had no one speak to it other than the proposers, are there any objections to approving this motion as it stands? No objections. Motion stands approved as submitted. Okay, so next issue, which we're going to move back into the targeted increase in egg production. And what I'd like to do is to, having served as board chair here for a while and agonized over this issue, and in particular, I would say, listen to people like Dennis Abbott and others, Richie White, on this issue. I'd like to kind of frame, and this will take me about 4 or 5 minutes. I'd like to frame what I think the issue is in terms of southern New England, and what I'm about to say basically comes out of almost all of the technical documents. In other words, if I voice my own opinion, I'll say so. There's no question, if you look at all the technical documents, there's no question that the southern New England stock is overfished, according to our current definition. But I would note that with the current fishing reference point is 35% below the threshold, and it's 27% below the target. And to me, this is really important because overfished in terms of the plan includes a time frame when the Long Island stock was extraordinarily healthy. The Long Island stock, as Mark and Jim are painfully aware, used to contribute almost 9 million pounds of landings to the southern New England portion of the population. That portion of the population currently, or that fishery in that area currently contributes, according to the most recent statistics, about 250,000 pounds. So in terms of dealing with overfished, to me, and this where you'll get into some personal opinions, I think we're dealing with an obsolete reference here. In other words, I went out of my way to talk to the state directors, who I have great respect for, and asked them very, excuse me, very pointedly, do you think it's possible for us to rebuild the Long Island stock? And I got almost unanimously no. And so let me ask this as a question so that the record is clear. Does anyone around the table think that we have the ability to rebuild the Long Island stock? And if a hand goes up, then I'll recognize you and ask you to say why. So does anyone believe that we can rebuild the population of Long Island Sound? Okay, so there are no hands up. So essentially we're dealing with a situation where we have a definition that's based on, I think, a 20-year time period where the environmental conditions have totally changed, and everyone's painfully aware of this. So if we can't get back to this is not a traditional type fishery management issue. Normally you deal with these things where the population is overfished, it's formulaic. you look at the current fishing mortality rates, you reduce the fishing mortality rates over a fixed period of time and rebuild the population. That's the way we normally do things. But in this case, because you've had a complete decoupling, and that's what the technical people have indicated, the stock recruitment relationship for the southern New England portion of the population has decoupled. And I'd note that I was a bit alarmed when I went to the northern New England meeting and some of the technical people started talking about the same thing manifesting itself in northern New England. So, I mean, to me, the technical advice has been clear on this, and I think it's important so that the record is clear. The stock has been in recruitment failure since 2011. We've had the SSB and recruitment essentially decoupled. And no one in this room, I think, has any control over that, nor do we have a really good understanding of why that has taken place. According to the technical people, the poor stock conditions are due to environmental conditions that have increased M, and specifically they reference water temperatures, larval survival, and predation, all having major negative impacts on the stock. So all of the technical projections indicate that if we were to handle this the way we normally handle all of our other fishery management issues, you'd have to have a 75 to 90% reduction in fishing mortality in order to stabilize the stock under current environmental conditions. So what we would be talking about with that, and that's straight out of the technical the reports, what we would be talking about is for a complete fishery closure. I mean, we shouldn't try to sugarcoat that. And factor in that southern New England lobster is at the fringe of its ideal habitat. Everybody knows that. The ideal habitat for lobsters now is in the Gulf of Maine, and who knows how long that condition will persist. Further complicating this whole situation we're in is that all of the projections that I've seen by the center staff basically indicate that the environment that southern New England lobster is in is going to change, and it's going to get worse. We have two papers by very distinguished NOAA scientists, Doctors Hare and Saba. Both of those indicate that water temperatures are going to continue to increase. So, I mean, we're trying to the point in all of this is we're trying to manage a stock that really is at the fringe of its resource, and there's no assurance, no matter what strategy the commission follows on this, that we can rebuild the stock. I think personally, this is a personal opinion, I think it's important for us to simply recognize that and state that in the record, and essentially state that we don't have expectations that we can rebuild a stock. Given the environmental changes that we're all confronting at this point, we just can't do this on a formulaic basis. Further complicating our life, and I'm almost done, is we have major disconnects, not only in the system itself, but in the science. And I, for one, and I've said this repeatedly, I started out as a lobster biologist, and I, for one, think that the science, the work by our technical committee, the work by the NOAA Science Center, particularly the projections that individuals like Burton Shank and others have done, the science, as far as I'm concerned, is the best science we've ever had on lobsters as long as I've been in the process. Unfortunately, we have a situation where that science is pretty much associated with the fringe of the lobster population. Lobster population, historically, 87% of the lobsters were caught inshore. And that's straight out of the technical reports. Now we have a situation where about 65 or 70% of the fishery is taking place offshore. So if you compare that to the actual science, the science is taking place, according to the technical memorandums, within 200 feet of water. So from the shore out to 200 feet. The fishery is taking place primarily in Area 3, according to the addendum, and I can point out the section in it, and from basically 300 feet of water out. So if you look at the science is coming from inshore. There's almost no sampling that's taking place in the deep areas. And this is not, I want to be clear, this isn't a criticism of NOAA, it's just a fact. It's a fact of life. To quote the technical memos, there are no, the technical committee has repeatedly noted the deficiencies in the offshore sampling program. I think I found at least 3 or 4 references to it. There are no larval surveys. There are no settlement surveys. There's limited ventless data. There's little current data on growth, movement, or survival. Each one of those parameters is absolutely a key if you want to do a lobster assessment or any other assessment. So, I mean, where we sit with this is the science is really good, close to the coast, and it's not adequate off of the coast. And the technical committee has repeatedly pointed out the need to do this, and that's one of the reasons the Lobster Board agreed to do Addendum 26, was to fill some of the holes in the science. Okay, and I'm almost done. That in terms of the federal sampling program, and some of the federal employees here can correct me if I misspeak, but when I served on the New England Council, I think there were somewhere between 15,000 and 17,000 observer days, totally, for Mid-Atlantic and New England. About 32 of those days are being spent on lobster in the offshore areas. So we have a major disconnect. And I think we've got a disconnect in terms of the science and our FMP in terms of the overfish definition. Personally, this is another personal opinion, I think that if we, 2 years from now, we're going to do another benchmark stock assessment, I have every confidence that our understanding of overfished will change when the scientists look at that. I mean, there may be ways to partition the southern New England stock and assess it in different ways than we have historically done, and that would shed some light on what the possibilities are. But I'd like to go back to one of the first points that I made. We're fishing this stock way below the referent targets and thresholds. And if we compared this, it would be a really interesting analytical exercise to compare this to how we are treating some of our other overfished stocks, like winter flounder and Gulf of Maine cod. I think Gulf of Maine cod's at 5% of the biomass target. Lobster is at about 45 or 50% of the biomass target. So, I mean, we have all these disconnects. So my conclusion is this is not formulaic. I think we should essentially acknowledge our situation that we can't rebuild the stock and be right up front with members of the public and members of the industry. The board said, when we set out the goals, we said we wanted to do something. Now, we went around the table yesterday, and I know I probably offended some people when I did that. but I wanted everybody to have a sense of how everybody else is kind of viewing this. The consensus that I heard was do nothing, okay? I'll be candid. I don't think that's an appropriate strategy. I would also note that the board has said we don't want to put the industry out of business. So what this means to me is that we need to do something. We need to do something that isn't too radical, that is incremental, that essentially moves the process forward in a short-term basis and doesn't put a lot of people out of business. We're not going to rebuild this stock, and I think that should be the drivers. So you've heard my comments. I'd open the floor before we actually get into the discussion of what is the target, and let anybody comment as you see fit. If you disagree with what I just said, please speak up. I'm not going to be the least bit offended. I've developed a really thick hide over the years for this type of stuff. So let me open it up. Anybody want to comment? Doug Greb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, this is a very challenging situation that we're in here. From my perspective, it's too bad that this board didn't recognize that they didn't think they were going to be able to rebuild this stock before they started down this road of this amendment. We've been dealing with trying to, in our climate change working group, come up with a variety of options that how the commission can adapt the management in light of climate change that we see occurring, and that we have science that's backing us up that it is impacting the stocks. One of the things that I think that when we're developing management plans, if we have science that says that we're not going to be able to rebuild because of climate change, we need to change the goals and objective. We need to make a policy decision here to change the goals and objective. And the goals and objectives that we're working on right now is from Amendment 3, and that was developed back in the 90s. Right now, the goals and objective of your management plan is that the Atlantic states will have a healthy American lobster resource and a management regime which provides for sustained harvest, maintain appropriate opportunities for participation, and provides for cooperative development of conservation measures by all stockholders. And then probably the most pertinent objective is to protect, increase, or maintain, as appropriate, the brood stock at levels that will minimize the risk of stock depletion and recruitment failure. We're not, I don't think this is, I think it's time that we change the goals and objectives with this. I mean, we can recognize, move forward with an action here and recognize that this is what we're thinking, that we can't rebuild it, but I think we need to put that in our plans in the future, and I hope that this board will take that that measure forward and start working on this in a follow-up amendment that will recognize that Southern New England is not going to rebuild.
Other comments? Tom Foti, and then Peter Burns.
I appreciate this understanding of we're not God and we can't do certain things. Well, we thought by restricting commercial and recreational catch and doing measures, we could basically bring back any stock. My biggest disappointment after sitting around this table for 27 years is weak fish. You think about it, weak fish was basically responsible for the Atlantic Coast Conservation Act. Because if it wasn't for Copper basically tackling weak fish, we wouldn't have this act, because we talked him into doing the Atlantic Coast Conservation Act. We did everything right. We put in strong commercial regulations, strong recreational regulations, went from 6-inch fish to a fish that was sexually mature by the time we harvested at least once, and the stocks collapsed. We did everything we could, and we couldn't stop from doing that. The same thing with winter flounder. We've had moratoriums for years. And these are both species that spawn when the first year. I mean, it's not where they have to wait like sturgeon, as I said, of the climate change, where they have to wait 25 or 30 years. These are fisheries that should have recovered in a couple of years if we put a moratorium, which we basically did on weakfish and winter flounder. So I realized this a couple of years ago with lobster. We keep spinning our wheels and saying we're going to do something to rebuild the stocks, and we can't do it. It's frustrating. It's hard to say you can't do something because that's what we're not designed to do. But I think I'm happy that the board has finally realized that some things we just can't correct, and we have to do it. I'm looking at this. We have to do it least painfully as possible to the people that depend on it for a living, and basically do that. If we're not going to have any impact on the stocks, and it ain't going to accomplish what we're doing, why are we doing it? And the same thing could be said for summer flounder, but that's another day. So thank you for, kind of consideration, and Dave, I appreciate your comments.
Peter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And David, I appreciate you prefacing the issue and going through everything that we've done and what the science has done. And I agree. I think the stock assessment information, the technical information we have now is better than it's probably ever been. And I feel fortunate that we have that to be able to guide us. As far as rebuilding the stock, I think we all knew that we weren't going to be able to rebuild it when we started this addendum, and we knew that we weren't even going to even try to stabilize it because it was going to take an 80 to 85% reduction in exploitation to get there, and we knew that that was a non-starter, and so that's why we went this route. And the purpose and need of this addendum really is still before us here, and I think it's still attainable, and it's to improve egg production while maintaining some functional portion of the industry, and I think we can do that. I'm very hopeful, despite all the disconnects and things like that we've been talking about. I think we're really poised as a board to really move forward and take some action here that can really make a difference. We've got some disconnects in place, but we know we've got a good stock assessment. It's still going to be 2 years before we get to the next assessment. I think to wait would be kind of squandering an opportunity. I had the opportunity to talk to, I don't know how many fishermen from southern New England last night, and I learned a lot. They're saying that there's good signs that there's egg-bearing lobsters, there's small lobsters that are coming through. Some of these ventless trap surveys and larval settlement is showing improvement, even in places like Buzzards Bay and Narragansett Bay, which have been virtual deserts in the last few years. Those kinds of things don't make me think that we shouldn't do anything because it's getting better. Those are the kinds of things that make me think, great, now we have an opportunity to take advantage of that. Ride that wave. If we do something now to help increase egg production, then we'll be all the better off probably if climatic conditions cooperate, and then we have another stock assessment in 2 years and we can reassess this. So we've got a lot of things that are happening here. We've got the Gulf of Maine issue looming over us right now. One of the things that we, as a working group, came forward with, one of the goals and objectives there was to be proactive. And I think even though we've been dealing with recruitment failure in southern New England here since 2011, we still have the opportunity to try to do something, and we can still stay within the purpose and need of this addendum and come out with some action that can meet that goal. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Got Richie White and then Emerson. Anyone else?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I commend you for turning the ship finally. This has been long in coming and overdue. We have started the process in Northern Shrimp. We've heard from the public in dealing with Northern Shrimp. How come Northern Shrimp gets a moratorium and Southern New England lobster doesn't? So we've been hearing that for some time. We tasked the technical committee this year to develop new reference points to a level of biomass that's approximately what we now have and a mere fraction of what rebuilding would be, because we because we believe from a policy standpoint, not a technical standpoint, that the shrimp will never recover due to climate change. And I think that's the direction that this board needs to do. I think we need to have new reference points so that when we take an action, it's based on science from the technical committee. Not going to rebuild Lobster to what it was, but there is a level at which you can have a harvest and probably maintain a much smaller population like what we have now. So you know, I think this clearly was an important moment. I applaud you for doing it, and I hope we continue to get down this road. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just follow up on one of the points that Richie made before. I've got 4 people on the list, but I neglected to mention this really important point. Lobster fishery in southern New England is now a mixed crustacean fishery. I mean, and all you have to do is look at the values of it. At this point, lobster landings basically worth about $18 million. Crab landings are worth even more than that. So it's about a $36 million fishery that's operating. But what you really need to look at is how the crab landings and the effort going into crabs. The effort is moving out of lobsters and it's moving into crabs, because the price of crabs, just since we had adopted the FMP for a whole variety of reasons related to the market, price of crabs has basically gone from 75 cents up to $1. And there was a boat in New Bedford in the past 6 months that landed 100,000 pounds of crabs. So to be blunt, those people don't even want to bother trying to set on lobsters. They're making sufficient money fishing on crabs. So that the effort is already, just due to the economic forces that are in place, the effort's moving out of the lobster fishery. One of the keys here is to not export the southern New England problem into the Gulf of Maine, which will be easy to do. If we impose really severe restrictions in southern New England, all those Area 3 boats have the permits already. They have landing licenses in most of the states. They simply shift their effort up into the Gulf of Maine, and you'll just accelerate the problems in the Gulf of Maine. So we need to do something reasonable here, and as Richie points out, develop some new reference points and a process to deal with this situation where it exists. We should be managing this as a mixed crustacean fishery and not as just a lobster fishery. So factor that in. I've got Emerson, Sarah, Mark, and Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your overview and assessment of where we are and where we might go. And I agree with what you had said, what your assessment is, and your overview, particularly relative to Area 6, as you pointed out. And when you asked the question, no one on this board disagreed with your assessment of what's taken place in Area 6. And to highlight what you said, you know, landings in Area 6 have already been reduced by 97%. Active permits have been reduced by about 85% in Area 6. And active traps fished have also been reduced by just over 90%. So there's been a significant reduction in Area 6, no matter what metric you want to look at. And additionally, working with the few remaining lobster fishermen that are still working in Long Island Sound, we've removed 16,000 derelict and abandoned pots that continue to fish. So I just wanted to highlight those metrics relative to Area 6. Thank you.
Sarah and then Mark Alexander. Sarah? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership and really setting the table this morning for us as we move forward. I think it's very helpful in getting through a very difficult topic. I just wanted to address the board to say, you know, join in the chorus of people who really feel, and I see this as a watershed moment, And with all due respect to a previous speaker, feeling that if climatic conditions cooperate within the next couple of years, maybe we can make different management decisions. It's taken us generations to get to where we are. This isn't a nimble dinghy that we can turn quickly. Doesn't mean we should turn our back on addressing the underlying climatic conditions, but it may take a generation or more to turn those around. And I think what we're tasked with today is making appropriate management decisions, but as we are doing that, to be as humane as possible to the human beings, the people, the men and women who are still in this fishery, and I will certainly use that as my guiding principle as we move forward today. Thank you.
Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your comments earlier and your touching eulogy for Long Island Sound. As Emerson pointed out, the population, lobster population in Long Island Sound is a vestige of what it once was. The fishing industry is a vestige of what it once was. And, you know, it was 18 years ago that we crossed this tipping point, going from an area of high productivity to the fringe of the range. And I don't think it's too far-fetched to assume that in the not too distant future we're going to pass beyond the range. And taking Doug's comments to heart, I think we need to think about this unprecedented occurrence and how do we manage a fishery that eventually going to disappear. You know, I think that conversation is important, and I think we need to have it, and that would help us figure out, you know, where we put our priorities in this situation. So, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I've got Eric, and then Mark Gibson, and then Tom. Mark, you want to go?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for framing the issue for us this morning. That was helpful. I agree with much of what you said. I might differ a bit on the implications of the Long Island Sound failure. Frankly, the fishery independent data there doesn't look much different than it does for Narragansett Bay or Massachusetts south of the Cape, and their larval surveys don't look much different than our settlement surveys. So I think we have a broad inshore failure. They do look different than, you know, the federal survey offshore, which hasn't declined nearly as much as the inshore area. So there's a disconnect between, as you pointed out, inshore science and management considerations and offshore. I agree with you that option A is not a place we want to end up. I think that would be bad optics for the commission to have an addendum that frankly doesn't do anything more than all the other addendums that are in place right now. I don't think that would be a good look. So I could support a, you know, a modest increase in egg production, you know, agreeing with some of the arguments that have made in favor of that. I fear, though, that given the projections in the stock recruitment relationship, the decoupling that you pointed out, which is, as an aside, scientifically interesting, but it's it really hampers our management ability. And I'm afraid that a modest increase in egg production is just it's going to be for naught. But I will support it because option A just isn't for me a place that the commission wants to end up. Thank you.
Eric, I was going to call on you next, but I'm going to take Pat Kelleher because okay. Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Coming down this morning, I think a few of us were wondering if this might be a 10-minute meeting based on the way the meeting ended yesterday afternoon with the poll vote, but I do commend you for framing it the way you have done. This is obviously a serious issue, but I can't get over the issues related to the environmental factors associated with this for southern New England. I think you're right. I think Richie White and Doug are also right regarding policy guidance when it comes to environmental changes related to these fisheries, the southern New England lobster, shrimp being the two primaries. We need better policy guidance on how we're going to deal with fisheries that look like they will not recover. We cannot engineer our way out of this problem in southern New England. It can't be done. And that is why I have stated what I did yesterday as far as status quo associated with the fisheries in southern New England. I completely agree with Representative Peake that we're in a situation that took a long time to get here. The conversations that are now starting to happen related to the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank are all about resiliency going forward. Could we put resiliency in place in what is nearly a collapsed or a collapsed fishery in southern New England? I don't think we can. I think we have to take into account the industry members going forward, and we need to base decisions, whether it is a small, as Mark says, whether it is just a small increase in egg production or no increase in egg production. I think going forward we need to make sure that it's clear why we are doing it, that it is a policy call from this board and from the policy committee, that we're not saying no and giving up on the fishery and on the industry. We're recognizing the fact that, again, we can't engineer our way out of a problem that probably should have been dealt with 10 or 12 years ago when there was a chance to build resiliency. So with that, I'll end my comments.
All right, anyone else want to comment here? Yes, Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listened to all the discussion today, but I still go back and you know, every week I'm getting calls from our constituents. New Jersey has areas 4 and 5 and some are 3. So there's a few permit holders for LCM A3. I think the annual harvest in New Jersey is about 500,000 pounds. I believe there's 10 to 15 full-time lobster harvesters from New Jersey. And they're all saying the same thing. We have a 32-day season closure in Area 4, which really equates to a 3-month season closure based on the restrictions of having to remove the traps from the water. You know, hundreds of traps. It takes them weeks, if not, you know, if not close to a month, to remove those traps and then put them back in. They can't fit 800, 1,200 pots on one 40-foot boat in one trip. And plus, they have to deal with the weather. So the other issue is the attrition. I say 10 to 15. You know, someone said 15. I don't even think it's that anymore. And every year there's 1 or 2 more that fall out. So soon we'll be in single digits. So any more reductions or restrictions that are placed on them as far as season closure goes, they're already taking a 3-month season closure. So anything addition to that season closure, will put them out of business. You know, as far as taking the traps out of the water, it's not only the effort and the time involved, it's they need to store them somewhere. And New Jersey waterfront property is quite expensive, even to rent. And they're finding it more and more difficult for that. I think I've suggested lease a barge and anchor it somewhere with all the traps on it. I don't even know if that's legal, to tell you the truth, but I am standing firm to what I quoted yesterday as far as status quo goes. Thank you.
Okay, anyone that hasn't had the opportunity to comment here? Then let's, yes, Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm struggling to find a place between 0 and something. I attended the public hearings and have, you know, listened to many conversations from not only fishermen but politicians, which is kind of a tough spot to be in. We've received plenty of correspondence, I think the Commission has as well, from our congressional delegation about the implications of doing almost anything. Having said that, my fear is that there's still a lot of effort. There's still, with the price of fuel, with the amount of traps that are still out there, that even if we view this as a moment where we're not going to rebuild the stock,
What is the message of doing nothing? What does that send out to the public? What does that send to fishermen? I was just saying to Mark, you know, when we go back, what's the likelihood that we could develop a regulatory change of any kind to restrict effort? So that's the part that I think I'm struggling with. I think you know, 20% certainly creates such an economic hardship in the Sound that it would be impossible to imagine a fishery at that level. But we had a good conversation last night, I think, based on that straw poll that I wasn't necessarily a fan of, and so to the extent that that did provide us an opportunity maybe to communicate, I don't know where we go from here or how we go there, but I do think that there's some room for improvement, even if it's state by state voluntarily, and I don't know how that would wash with option A.
You know, let me just follow up on Craig's point so that everyone's clear. Grant Moore made this point yesterday, so I'm just repeating it. Status quo is kind of a misnomer. The Commission has already promulgated regulations for two areas, Area 3 and Area 2. Those two areas contribute 3/4 of the landings to the stock. Both of those areas have already promulgated regulations to cut traps. Now, you can get into a policy debate about how much credit should be given for that, but so the technical committee basically said that with a whole group of caveats, you may get as much as, let me rephrase this so somebody doesn't take offense. You may get somewhere between 0 and 13% increase in egg production from the existing trap cuts. And you can argue where you are on that continuum, but the fact of the matter is those have already been promulgated. They're going to be implemented in those two areas. So there are going to be changes that reduce exploitation on the stock. We can get into the policy debate. Is it enough? Should we do more? Those types of things, but there is some action. Now, I'm not suggesting, so everyone's clear, that we just rely on that. I think we need to do something other than that to supplement that. But I also agree with this strategy of, you know, doing something that doesn't put a whole bunch of people out of business. The other point I would quickly make is that if you look at the offshore lobster landings, as the technical people have said and as the staff included in the document, the landings offshore are stable. They're not going down. They haven't gone down 80%. They're fairly stable. And so it's we have, and this is what I struggle with, we have this disconnect between the inshore areas and the offshore areas. They're sending us two entirely different signals. Not that everything offshore is great, but it is a mixed crustacean fishery offshore now. So let me go back to my list, and I have Dan, and then what I would like to get into is a specific option to move forward. So I'm probably going to look for a motion. Dan.
Thank you, David. You just said a lot of the things that I wanted to say, that status quo is not the equivalent of doing nothing. In Massachusetts, we have our Area 2 fishermen, and we are in the middle of this trap allocation reduction schedule. And based on the analysis that I've done, and I know I pledged at the last meeting that I would come forward with some data, but I wasn't able to get the data completed until last Friday, and it still requires a little bit of an audit. But I can tell you that the first 25% cut did not necessarily cut active traps, but I believe the next 25% will. And so we're really in the middle of a major management scheme. And what's interesting, if you look at the guys behind us who've come up from Massachusetts, they're all pretty young. You know, so this really isn't a dying fishery, but this is a fishery where younger guys are diversifying into the crab fishery and the whelk fishery and the fish pot fishery and the lobster fishery as well. And, you know, I am not going to sit by and even though we aren't going to be able to rebuild this stock to historic levels, we're not done managing this fishery. As we cut these trap allocations to fairly draconian levels, we're going to need compliance checks, we're going to need enforcement to make those regulations real. And I pledge to do that and work with the fishermen. So, and we also have a V-notching requirement. We kind of forget that all Area 2 lobstermen are supposed to V-notch all legal size eggers. Well, we need to sort of double up on our efforts to make sure there's compliance with that. So doing nothing to me is kind of a misnomer because we're in the middle of a very massive administrative exercise of reducing trap allocations that are going to reduce traps in the water by the time we're done in 5 years. And the other thing I'd like to mention is it's really difficult when you sit down and try to document the net effects of some of these rules because there's so much leakage. I can't look at my Massachusetts-only data and show the effect that I hope to show because I have some permits coming from the West joining the Massachusetts fleet, which is perfectly legal. A federal permit can be sold to a Massachusetts fisherman fishing in Area 2 or Area 3. And so I have trouble teasing that out. I have Area 3 fishermen who can go back and forth. I have the effort attributable to the Jonah crab fishery, which is almost impossible to tease out in terms of whether it's, as you pointed out, a lobster trip or a crab trip. And so, and I also have, I have some Area 2 fishermen fishing east of Nantucket, which is essentially the Georgia's Gulf of Maine stock, but that's all legal. So it's fairly difficult to actually nail down the net effect. But I think you're seeing I guess, not to be redundant, but the trends here are that it's a bunch of young guys, they're diversified, they're ready to accept a lot of the ongoing trap cuts, they're ready to make a go of it, but it is a very conservative plan. So this is status quo is not doing nothing.
Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that you had asked for a motion on how we're going to move forward as a board here, but I'd like to just ask the question of you first for your guidance as to whether or not we must select option A, B, C, D, or E here, or is there an opportunity based on the fact that we had a range of alternatives that went from 0 to 60? Is there a potential here for something in between 0 and 20, such as a 10% reduction? And the reason why I ask is, you know, I mentioned yesterday that we would support status quo, that, you know, the overwhelming majority of folks who offered public comment felt that way. But then there was a group of people who, you know, who said in their testimony that, well, we agree with status quo, however, we might be able to stretch and reach to something like 20%. And, but I do believe that 20% is a stretch. Maryland's fisherman with an A, that's man with an A, is here representing himself today, and you know, he and I have spoken about how far of a stretch that he could make in order to have a viable business continue. And while I do agree with the other board members that maybe 0, doing nothing, even though there's the trap reduction happening as we speak, doing nothing might not be where this board wants to be, but we could support a very modest increase, potentially at 10%. I'm not making that as a motion. I look around the table to see, first of all, ask if that's appropriate, and then I guess we can go from there. Thanks.
Yeah, I would defer to the staff, particularly the executive director, but yeah, from my perspective, the commission always has the right to do something between the options. And Bob, if you disagree with that, please speak up.
Well, I will speak up to agree with you, not disagree with you. Yeah, you're right. You know, 10% or whatever other number is within the range that was taken out to public comment, so it's definitely inbounds for the board to consider.
Now, what that will mean is we'll have to recalculate the tables, but that's not a difficult task to do. Okay, so Eric Reed, I'm looking for a motion at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everybody. I'm not going to waste any more time. I don't know whether or not it would be option F or some other letter or a number, pick whatever you want, but I move that we support a 10% increase in egg production over 2 years.
All right, we have a motion. Do we have a second to that motion? Anyone care to second the motion? Mark, we can't get a second from the same state. Somebody want to second the motion? Mike, discussion on the motion. Peter Burns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad we're moving forward with getting down to business here about increasing egg production. I think that the one thing I do like about this is the opportunity to spread this out over 2 years. I think 10% is a start. I'm hopeful that there's a silver lining in there somewhere where we can find a way to credit trap reductions that have already taken place or that are scheduled to take place. We know that we have the Area 3 trap caps that have yet to be implemented yet. We're going to talk about that later today. So I think that there's some room to move here a little bit, and in consideration of stretching this out over 2 years, I think that's a good opportunity, and that gets us to our next stock assessment. So I'm going to make a motion to amend this to 20% increase over 2 years.
Okay, so we have a motion to amend. Is there a second on the motion to amend? Any second? Any second? Motion dies due to a lack of a second. Further discussion on the original motion. Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a motion to amend that motion. And my amendment would be move to implement a 10% increase in egg production, except in Area 6, which would remain at status quo.
Emerson, just maybe my hearing, did you say 10%? They put 20% up there.
10%.
10%, okay. Is there a second?
Move to implement a 10% increase in egg production, except for Area 6, which would remain at status quo.
Okay, do we have a second to that? No second? No second. Motion dies due to a lack of second. Mark Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to offer the same motion, except that in Area 6, it would be 5%.
All right, we're going to have to let the staff catch up here. So it's a motion to amend to 10% increase in production, except in Area 6, which would remain, which would achieve a 5% reduction. Is that correct, Mark?
Yes, I would like to add one thing, that would be over 2 years.
For both Area 6 and everyone else would be 2 years?
Yes.
We need to add the 2-year provision to the motion. Right. It's in the original motion. Made over 2 years. Okay, everyone clear on this? Discussion on a motion to amend. Emerson.
Second. I'll second that motion.
Okay. So made and seconded. Discussion on the motion. Any discussion? Tom Foti.
Again, I'm looking at what we're doing here. We're splitting hairs again. We're basically talking about 5% or 10% reduction, knowing that climate change is not going to turn around in a couple of years. Or, as Sarah pointed out, it'll be decades maybe before we basically see a turnaround if we actually admit there is a climate change. And so just to say we're doing something where I don't see this, I mean, with the number of pots that have been reduced in New Jersey, the number of fishermen that's been reduced in New Jersey from lobstermen, the lack of effort that's going out there compared to what it was 15 years ago, we've done those types of reduction and we're just not seeing any increase because of that. So I have a hard time supporting any of these motions.
All right, thanks, Tom. Anyone else? Emerson, and then Craig, and then Mark Gibson. Excuse me. Go right
Thank you,
ahead.
Mr. Chairman. Relative to this motion to amend, I would just like to reiterate some of the metrics that I pointed out before. That in Area 6, we've already seen a 97% reduction in landings. We've seen an 82% reduction in active permits. And we've seen a 91% reduction in active traps fished. That's already occurred in Long Island Sound, Area 6.
All right, as I said, I'm going to go right up the table. Craig, then Mark, and then I'm going to go over to Doug Grout. Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're dealing with a couple of things in Connecticut. For those of you that get the newspaper out of Connecticut, we're still in the midst of a very significant deficit this year, forecasting another $500 million next year and somewhere around $800 million beyond the deficit that was pegged back in January. So it approaches $2 billion. One of the concerns that I have about not having some number up there in terms of increased egg production is I have a heck of a time trying to advocate for money. Staff, hard hiring freeze doesn't really even allow us to put somebody on a boat. I think any number up there beyond 0 is going to cause me a fair amount of agita when I go back and talk to the fishermen, because they would have loved to, I think, gotten out of this with 0. So it doesn't put me in a comfortable place, but I think it puts me in a place where I can continue with the conversation. So I'd hope that there'd be a fair amount of support for this motion. It's not perfect. I think it gives us a platform to talk about a future, whatever size that might be. We still have a lot of traps in Connecticut that we need to work on. We still need to work on licensing, and as I said, we still need to work on trying to provide resources for an agency that, absent resources, will have no scientists and no enforcement if some people have their way. So this, I think, is a help for Connecticut.
All right, I've got, let's see, Mark and then Doug Grout.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to ask the maker of the motion, what the biological rationale is for nuancing, between Area 6 and the remaining areas in southern New England. I've previously stated that what's being seen in Long Island Sound not very different than what's happening in Narragansett Bay or Buzzards Bay or places like that. So I'd like to hear more about what the rationale is for nuancing this in this manner.
Mark, you want to respond?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The decline in Long Island Sound happened earlier, and I would hazard to say to a larger degree than it has anywhere else. We've been struggling with this for years. We've reached a point where our industry is on the verge of extinction, and trying to achieve a 10% increase in egg production would pretty much spell the end to our industry. I know maybe this comes down to a choice of what goes first, the fish or the fisherman, but we do want to do something, but we don't want to kill the industry either. So.
All right, thanks, Mark. I've got Doug Grout, Dan, Jim Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do appreciate the efforts of this board in trying to accomplish something here with this addendum. With the vote that we took yesterday, which in retrospect I wish we'd waited till after this, I still have concerns about having this apply throughout the range of Area 3. I still think that we need to have a line, despite the difficulties and the problems that may cause, because you're implementing changes in management on a fishery and a resource that is at record levels out on the Georges Bank area. So if this does pass, I would appreciate it if we could get some either some indication of how we might address this where it wouldn't apply to the actual Georges Bank area, either by reconsidering the motion or if there's some other mechanism where there could be a line drawn there where you wouldn't be implementing more restrictive management measures on a resource that's fully rebuilt.
Thanks, Doug. Dan passed. I've got Jim Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just in terms of the difference between maybe a little further north from us versus Long Island Sound, if you go to our public hearing, we had a packed room, and it was very different. In fact, if you look over at the New England side, you've got a lot of young guys coming up. No offense, John, but I've got John German here, and he kind of represented the demographic in the room. A lot of guys that have watched this fishery die, and essentially are to the point where they're maybe, it was more like a wake, that meeting, anything else. And it was sort of, in that respect, you know, maybe give them a respectful death of this fishery as opposed to like trying to impose some limits that really are meaningless. And so that is really why we want, you know, Long Island Sound to be a separate issue on this, because it's very different. We don't have a bunch of young guys coming up in the fishery. We have a lot of, you know, historic folks that have, you know, it's a difficult time that they've had for many years now, and watch this thing go away. So for Long Island Sound, I really wish we could go with 0%, because I think we should have them hold harmless. The 10%, I'll just, you know, just make one comment on that. And as you summarized before, Dave, you did a great job of bringing this all together, is that, you know, the 10% is, you know, it's like a great New York philosopher said, you know, it's deja vu all over again. We went through this a few years ago, and we got to 10% and then got another stock assessment, and then we're right back to where we are again. So if we do go with the 10%, we clearly need to take what your leadership suggested and come up with a new approach to this, because I really don't want to go through another few years and get to 10% again and just watch more and more, you know, wasted effort on something that we can't fix. Thank you.
Yeah, personal comment that the thing I much appreciate about the motion is, and the amended motion is, that it gets us to the next stock assessment. Because as I indicated before, I think things are going to change. Okay, so are we ready for the motion to amend? Peter Burns.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to address Doug Grout's comment about the line in Area 3. I think that, well, first of all, I'll start off and say that I think you already know that NOAA Fisheries is very concerned about the condition of the stock, and concerned about making sure that we do something meaningful here to within our charge here in the purpose and need of this addendum to improve egg production and preserve some level of the fishery. So I think we're moving in that direction, but keep in mind that this fishery is moving into federal waters. Most of it is in federal waters. In Area 6, we don't really have a dog in the fight there, but most of the fishery in southern New England is in federal waters. And we've strived as an agency here to be cooperative partners with Lobster Management since 1998, when we transferred management authority from the Magnuson-Stevens Act over to the Atlantic Coastal Act. And I think we've done a good job with that, being good partners, and with the exception of a few disconnects that we're going to talk about later on. But I think we're hopeful that there's still some room to be able to decrease fishing mortality here and be able to get an upswing in egg production if we can. So I think one thing we don't want to do is unnecessarily impact the Georges Bank portion of the Area 3 stock. We can certainly, you know, I heard the vote yesterday. There wasn't a lot of movement on the industry or the states to go forward with a line to split the stocks. But that's something we could certainly consider as part of any kind of management strategy moving forward, to make sure that the Georges Bank stock doesn't get unnecessarily burdened by any management measures that go forward here. So I think that's something to keep in mind, and I think that with that, I'd like to try again to make a motion to change the 10% to 15%.
Here, let's deal with a motion on the table. If you want to make after we deal with that, if you want to make another motion to amend, you're free to do that. But that way we won't have 3 motions on the table at the same time.
Okay.
Okay, so let me ask everyone to take a 1-minute caucus, and then we'll call a question on the motion to amend. All right, we're going to come back into session. I apologize, but there are a lot of questions that different people have raised, and most of them relate to what might happen in a subsequent motion, which is I'll put on my Karnak the Magnificent hat and be able to tell you what the future bears here. Okay, so on a motion to amend, are you ready for the question? Let's, all those in favor of the motion to amend signify by raising your right hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 in favor, opposed? Five opposed. 6 opposed. Pete Burns. Let's do the opposed one more time, because I had some of these. 1, 2, 3. 6 opposed. Any abstentions? Any null votes? Motion fails. With 2 abstentions, I believe. Okay, so you're back on the main motion. You ready for the question on the main motion? Okay, Pete Burns, you, and just so everyone's clear here, Peter made a motion before which failed to request 20%. Now, my understanding, he wants to make a motion to do 15%, which is entirely appropriate.
That's right, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and I'm sorry that my lapse in judgment over the last motion there. I forgot that there was a motion to amend on the table. So yes, a motion to substitute 10% for 15%.
All right, we have a motion to substitute. Is there a second? Seconded by Doug Grout. Discussion. Mark Gibson.
Yeah, but it's just in the process we're following here. Is it your intention to have a discussion about the Area 3 line matter pending the outcome of these?
I'm a little reluctant to comment, and I totally understand that issues are intertwined, but I'm a little reluctant to combine those two, because if we get into we can't make a commitment to change the motion from yesterday without another motion, which is going to get complicated. And to some extent, I envision getting into that issue when we get into issue number 2. In other words, when we get into the second aspect of the management tools, I mean, the concern that was voiced during the break here is if the line exists, is that going to force individuals to relocate into the Gulf of Maine and drive effort into the Gulf of Maine? And actually, while I'm saying this, Grant Moore, the chair of the AP, asked to just make a brief comment on that. Grant, do you want to do that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just would like to reiterate what I spoke about yesterday, and this is from industry. If that line is instituted, depending upon what percentage is chosen by the commission, If the percentage is so high, you will see a total shift in effort. That line will, the fishermen are going to go up east of the line. With this underlying motion at the 10%, again, I'm going to say that 0 is not a realistic number. 10% is, we're going to achieve over 10% with trap reductions that are already in place. And that's from the TC. And this industry, Area 3 fishermen, have already gone through a 32% reduction in effort in the early 2000s with no credit there. Gauge increases, we're up to a 3 and 17/30 seconds. So no credit there. So the industry's been very proactive. This motion here, if there's a line drawn and we try to put separate regulations on part of Area 3 and it's going to affect the Gulf of Maine, Georges bank stocks, there will be a huge shift in effort. Thank you.
All right, so the motion on the board is to substitute, and actually, Peter, what you said is 15% to 10%. We've got them reversed up here. That correct? Is the motion correct, Peter?
Yes, substitute 15%, substitute
15% for 10%.
Substitute 10 with 15%.
15 to 10.
As long as we end up with 15 at the end, that's the intent.
15 for 10. Okay. So further discussion on the substitute motion. Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope that if this motion fails, we don't now have another motion at 14% or 13% or do Menhaden all over again, which is this afternoon. It was the overwhelming consensus yesterday that status quo was acceptable. Of course, smarter people than I spoke this morning, and Mr. Chairman, you framed the discussion very well. I don't think status quo is anywhere near what the perception of status quo is, what I should say. 10% is enough to keep these guys fishing. 15% is too much. So I hope this motion fails and we get back to business at 10% over 2 years.
Emerson Hasbro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I cannot support this motion. A 15% increase in egg production and what that would precipitate in terms of additional restrictions on the industry is going to be devastating to Area 6.
Anyone other than the maker of the motion or the seconder want to speak in favor of this motion? Anyone? All right, Peter, you get the last bite of the apple, and then I'm going to call a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the board's indulgence as I try to find the sweet spot here as we move forward, but I think we're moving in the right direction. I think 15 is reasonable. We've even heard Grant from the Area 3 industry say that they've already think they've got 10% just with the trap reductions that are in place. So I'm confident that over a 2-year period we could certainly have something reasonable that can be implemented by the industry. And keep in mind that we started this as a range between 20 and 60%, and then we had status quo as a default. We know that we've gotten guidance from our staff here that these lower percentages are okay, but I think that's something to keep in mind. We know that status quo is a non-starter for us, and I think 15 makes sense. Thank you.
All right, anyone want to offer something totally new here? If not, I'm going to call a question. All right, ready? Need a caucus? Anyone need a caucus? All right, so you ready for the question? All in favor of the motion signify by raising your hand. This is a motion to substitute. You got 2 in favor, opposed, same sign, 1, 2. 8 opposed, any abstentions? Any null votes? Motion fails. Okay, you're back on the original motion. You ready for the question? All in favor signify by raising your right hand. Yeah, 1, 2.
Wait, yeah.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Voting on the underlying motion, move to implement a 10% increase in egg production to issue 1 over 2 years. Is that worded correctly here? What is the, oh, in issue 1 over 2 years. Everyone understand the motion? Mark?
I just want to clarify one thing. When I made my motion to amend and added the 2-year period, the 2-year period got added initially to the underlying motion before it got added to mine. So I don't think the 2-year period was in there when the original motion was made.
Eric Reed, was that what you intended?
It is. It's what I intended, and it's what I said.
Right. Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just wondering if you're going to take any public comment before we end up voting on what our increase in egg production might be.
Good thought. I'm willing to take a few comments from any of the leadership of the association, but I'm going to have to ask you, the industry reps, to be very brief at this point. Sarah?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could take a moment to speak to the underlying motion, I think there was a lot of discussion around the amended motions, right? Motions. It is emotional. I'm not in favor of the underlying motion. I'm not really sure why it's up there when we have just heard from Mr. Grant that 10% is probably already going to happen with trap reductions. So are we engaging in management, or is this theater that we're engaging in? Because we have a difficult time going home to say we supported status quo. If status quo is going to get us to the 10% increase in egg production, I would think that we should vote this down and vote for status quo. And an additional concern of mine is the uncertainty with issue 2, what the management tools are going to be. I know in a brief offline discussion with my colleagues here from Massachusetts, there's one of those options that we feel that we can live with, and the other 2 are somewhat draconian. So I think given the uncertainty of issue 2, plus the information we've received already that status quo will get us to the 10% increase in egg production, we should just defeat this and move forward with what is forthright and transparent and call it what it is. Thank you.
All right, let me take a couple of comments from the audience. Jarrett, you had your hand up. Greg Mataronis. Yes, John.
All right, now I'm getting nervous. I thought I could do this before. I had a written speech. I don't want to be boring, just read something that I had written, but I can't memorize it all, so I'm going to read it. I'll try to make it riveting to keep your attention. So my name is Jarrett Drake. I've been Area 2 lobsterman for the past 33 years. Currently the Vice President of the Massachusetts Lobstermen Association, an LCMT2 member, and generally regarded as a pretty decent guy. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak, because it's important to me and all Southern New England fishermen. Actually, 8 of us Area 2 lobstermen are here today, forfeiting 2 days of fishing and $300 out of our pockets. And yesterday, I spent my birthday here with you. Status quo. We've been hearing that a lot today. I'd like to remind you, as it's been said many times, that status quo is not actually status quo, but in fact a 50% reduction in traps started 2016 that is taking place entirely after the 2011-13 stock assessment, which is why we're here. We are not greedy fishermen who don't want to do anything. Actually, it's in our best interest to maintain a healthy population. The few of us left just want time to reflect these current actions, and as a result, the next stock assessment will be positive. As a lobsterman and ventless survey captain, I am personally seeing lobsters now in volumes and locations that have been quiet for years, and I assure you will too. Anecdotally, we are seeing it. Now, just waiting for the data to catch up.
The current plan will have a dramatic impact on fishermen and their efforts. There's absolutely no need for gauge increases or seasonal closures in Area 2. A gauge increase will simply shift efforts further offshore to unsafe waters and designate the inshore areas as mere nurseries without a fishery at all. Lobstering is also the only fishery we can do year-round, and seasonal closures will have a severe impact on the fishermen's livelihoods. Right now, there are only about 18 full-time mass Area 2 lobstermen left, and only a few of them actually have 800 trap licenses. Most of us have a lot less. I am not one of the lucky ones. You see, I have to buy a state license and a federal license to make one equivalent to mine. So the ability for me to build back up to a full 800 traps is extremely difficult today. There's just no tags available. There's no latent effort to buy into. So in closing, the most prudent thing to do would be to delay any further management actions until the 2014-16 stock assessment. There's a lot of optimism surrounding the data, and we're looking forward to positive results. A little more time won't hurt, especially since the fishermen aren't to blame here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jared. Greg Mataronis. And then I'm going to go to John German. Is there any other leadership in the industry that wants to speak, address the board? If not, we're going to go back to the motion after those two. Greg. Greg's the president of the Rhode Island Lobster Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the board for the opportunity to be here and speaking in front of you. As Dave mentioned, I am the president of the Rhode Island Lobstermen's Association. I've been lobstering for over 25 years and involved in all aspects of research and involved in the management of this fishery as much as possible for almost 2 decades, which is hard to believe right now. So I think for the most part, this 10% motion for 10% is very reasonable to the industry, especially considering that we've got 50% trap cuts for Area 2, and I've heard that the first 25% is only cutting into latent effort. As Jarrett just mentioned, it's actually cutting almost to the bone already, where trap tags are, you can't find trap tags right now. Another implication of the trap cuts was Area 2 and Area 3 traps got coupled together. Area 3 tags are worth much more, so those are being bought off of Area 2 boats, brought out to Area 3, and will never be brought back into Area 2 again. So that's something that is not captured in the database. It's something that has not been talked about. In addition, they were coupled to Area 1 permits. So if someone qualified for 800 Area 1 traps, and they also have Area 2 or Area 3 allocation, as soon as they sell one trap off of that permit, the Area 1 permit goes away. So the incentive is there to not sell any traps off of that. So those tags are also tied up and will not be re-entering our fishery. So the bottom line is that first 25% did much more than get rid of latent effort. And with that in mind, I would also like to, for the next issue, industry really needs option A to move forward in issue 2, because we need the flexibility. The board has been very gracious to this point in building flexibility into this addendum, and if anything other than option A is selected in issue 2, I think the flexibility will be completely gone, and as Representative Sarah just said, it will be quite draconian and will force our hand into something where we will be out of business. And the board has stated that we want a functional portion of the lobster fishery. At this point, we are at the basis of a functional portion of the lobster fishery. After this, bait dealers go away, lobster shops go away, trap shops go away, any associated businesses go away, tourism, if we get any more cuts than what we have on the table right now. Thank you.
John, if you'd like to come up, why don't you use that microphone right next to Emerson? And then we're going to go back to the board.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name's John German. I'm president of Long Island Sound Lobstermen's Association. I like to say I've been fishing all my life, but really that's not true yet. But I fished in Long Island Sound for 51 years. Right now we have approximately 10 guys on the New York side fishing in Long Island Sound. We have probably about the same amount or maybe less in Connecticut side. It comes to less than 20 guys. I notice in this room there's probably about 75 people in this room, so that's almost 4 times as many people sitting in this room that fish in the entire Long Island Sound. I've been involved in this process since and sitting in front of this board since Amendment 3. I've seen now we're up to Addendum 25 on Amendment 3, which probably equates to about 50 to 60, 50 restrictions on lobsters through all those addendums, and I find it hard to believe that somebody in this room thinks that by adding 2 or 3 more restrictions in this room, in this species, is going to change something after, if you want to call it, failure of 50 restrictions. 2 or 3 more is going to help something. Right now, we're just in survival mood. I agree with the chairman that we're probably, not going to change anything by these addendums, or maybe we should reassess the way the stock is assessed in Area 6. But so be it. I would like to see status quo, just so the rest of us can just live out our lives and die and catch lobsters. The little bit that we can, because as Jim stated, there is no young fishery in our addendum. We haven't had any new licenses given out since 1994. We've reduced our pots from our initial allocation was 360,000 in the New York side of Area 6. I think last year there was probably in Area 6 on the New York side about 5,000 tags bought. Not all were fish, but they were bought. And like I said, I would like to see status quo, and I will leave you with the thought that, if I may quote Sir Walter Scott, he said, "That's not fish you're eating, that's men's lives." And that's the same thing with these lobsters. That's men's lives you're fooling with here right now. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks, John. We'll get back to the board. Anyone have a new thought that they have not offered? Mike, it's always nice to have someone volunteer a new thought.
This isn't necessarily a new thought, and I'm sorry about that, but Mr. Reed and my motion hadn't been on the board long enough for me to, I wanted to just go on the record that I supported the motion for the discussion purposes, and that I'm not necessarily sold on the 10%. I feel for the Long Island Sound and the issue that you guys have, and seeing 10% as maybe just too much, because I'm hearing that anything more than the 10% is just too much for the guys I represent. So I just wanted that to be on the record, and I'll leave it with that if anyone else has any additional thoughts.
Anyone else? 1 minute caucus, and then we're going to vote. All right, as I announced, we're going to vote. On the motion on the board, motion is to implement a 10% increase in egg production in issue 1 over 2 years. All those in favor of the motion signify by raising a hand. 1, 2, 4, 5 in favor. Opposed? 6. Motion fails. Any abstentions or null votes? Okay, so the motion fails. Where we are is essentially at status quo. Anyone have another motion to make? Sarah.
I would move for issue 1, option A, 0% increase in egg production, status quo.
Is there a second? Seconded by Emerson Hasbrook. Discussion on the motion. Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was really optimistic coming into this meeting after your initial comments that we were really going to stay away from status quo, knowing that it was really a non-starter for all of us, and that we were going to try to do what we can to try to help this stock to survive and help this fishery to survive, too. I certainly hear the comments of the fishermen, and I take those to heart, but I still think that there's some room here that we can do something, and to walk away from it right now, I think would really be a failure of this board after the past year that we spent trying to get the best science available to make these decisions. And it's unfortunate because, as I said before, our agency is looking at this very, very closely, and to walk away from this without doing nothing is not going to be taken very lightly. And as I said, you know, we've been cooperative partners in state federal lobster management now for 2 decades, and so this would be unfortunate if it had to go to the feds to have to take some kind of action if the board themselves decided not to do anything today.
Any other comments on the motion on the board? Okay. No comments. 1-minute caucus. Then we're going to vote. We've still got caucusing going on. I'll give you one more minute. Mike, have you got a question? Or Mike?
Yeah, I really appreciate all the discussion around the table, and I very much listened to your comments, Mr. Chairman, at the beginning of the meeting, and I had thought that we would find ourselves in a position to be taking some action. That action obviously is not going to be a significant action, but some action I thought was appropriate. I know that we already caucused, and I would hope, I guess you're planning to call the question, but I'm thinking here that this is like Menhaden all over again. But perhaps we should consider 5%. That way we show signs of forward progress, yet we don't walk away from the table at doing nothing. So if you're willing to accept it, Mr. Chairman, I would move to substitute for option A and replace it with 5% increase in egg production.
It's certainly within your right to make a motion to substitute. Is there a second to that? Seconded by Eric Reed. Discussion on the motion to substitute. Actually, what I think I would like to do here is we have very limited time to get through the rest of this, but I would point out to you, as a young lady to my right just pointed out to me, if we vote for 0, this entire addendum dies. Nothing takes place. So I'm going to take a 5-minute break. What I would encourage people to do is talk among yourself, and then we'll come back and take up the substitute motion. Thank you. Let me just say that there's been a lot of good discussion that's gone on. I've heard kind of two views. One is to vote and approve the substitute motion, and then there's another body of thought around the table that maybe we ought to go back and reconsider the 10% position. But I'm just going to deal with these things mechanically. So on the motion to substitute, any further discussion on that? Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have concern with this because it accomplishes so little, yet there's going to be a lot of administrative work that would result. Essentially, this is a form of status quo, but with this, you'd have to go to each of the LCMTs. Each of the states would have to develop some rules. They accomplish, status quo accomplishes the same thing as 5% from my perspective.
So, Doug, you fall into the camp, not trying to put words in your mouth, of going back to 10%. You were more comfortable with 10%.
We were more comfortable with 10%, yes.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments here? Pete Burns.
Well, I appreciate Mike Luisi's flexibility here to help us move the ball forward. I think this is a step in the right direction. Do I think 5% is enough? No. And I think even 10%, we're really not really hitting the mark. But I would vote in favor of this just because it's moving in the right direction. But I would expect that this isn't the last of the issue, and I think that we're going to have to look at this, reevaluate it when I get back, brief the folks back home about this, and see whether or not additional action needs to be made, or maybe make recommendations for the board to reconsider additional motions once the impacts of whatever happens with this are realized. Thank you.
Anyone else around the table? All right, so does anyone need a caucus? We already had a caucus. On the motion to substitute, you ready for the question? All those in favor, raise your right hand. 6, 7, and no, wait, I had a couple of hands go up and down. Raise your hands again, please. 1, 2, 3, 6 in favor. Opposed? 4 opposed. 5 opposed. Any abstentions? Any null votes? So the motion carries. You now have a main motion, which is constituted by the substitute motion. Further discussion on this? Any discussion? Emerson and then Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you recall yesterday when he did a general canvass of all the states, we said in New York that we supported status quo for Area 6 and that we might consider an increase in egg production for other areas in southern New England. And so now there was no support among the board to exempt Area 6 from a couple of different actions that we took earlier, or proposed to take earlier. So now we're with a 5% reduction, and depending on what we do with management measures to get to that 5%, it's my understanding that for areas 2 and 3, they may accomplish this 5% reduction without any additional action. And in Area 6, where we've already reduced by 95% landings and effort and so forth, we're going to go back and tell our Area 6 fishermen they're going to have to take a further reduction here to meet a 5% increase in egg production. And in areas 2 and 3, they may not have to take any additional action. So I can't support this.
Yeah, Emerson, let me just comment on that, and this is not rebuttal by any way, shape, or form, but that coin has two sides. What I heard when I went to the public hearings, particularly from the Area 3 fishermen, Area 2 fishermen, Area 3 fishermen have implemented restrictions that require, I think, a 55% cut in traps. The Area 2 fishermen have also instituted a cut of 50%. Area 6 did not institute any of those cuts. Area 4 did not institute any of those cuts. Area 5 did not institute any of those cuts. So I agree with your statement, but I think this is the opposite of the circumstance that just played out over the past few years. You had 2 areas instituting cuts where 3 other areas did not institute the cuts. So this is just the opposite. Further discussion on this. Are you ready? Sarah, excuse me.
Thank you, and I guess I feel like today what I'm focused on is sort of the big picture, and what I hear us discussing here, whether we're at 0%, 5%, 10%, what I sense in the board is that we are struggling as managers to work in this new world of our acknowledgement of climate change and the impact that that has on this particular fishery. So I guess moving forward, what we have to think about is are our goals and objectives in line with what the reality out on the water is today? Are our reference points the appropriate reference points? I know that there's a climate change working group that is putting together a report and looking at these various issues. Maybe this is something that we can discuss further at the November annual meeting. Maybe the Climate Change Working Group will have something for us to work over, and perhaps this is going to lead to a new addendum as we think about what the management practices are specifically for the southern New England lobster stock. But for me, one of the reasons I'm supporting now the lowest increase in egg production that we've talked about is because we're using old management tools inside of a new world. And as I spoke about earlier, I think we have to act with the science that we have, but also as humanely as possible to protect the human beings who are still working inside of this fishery. Thank you.
All right, thank you. You ready for the question? All those in favor of the motion, which is to move to implement a 5% increase in egg production for issue 1, all those in favor signify by raising your hand. Seven in favor, opposed. 4 opposed. Any no votes? Any null votes? Motion carries. Okay, so you decided issue 1. We're going to move immediately, because of the timing issue, into issue 2, which is the management tools. There's already a lot of discussion on the management tools. A lot of discussion has taken place on this. Megan, if you could quickly outline this, the options, and then what I'm going to do is seek a motion on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question here is kind of what tools in the toolbox can be used to achieve that 5% increase in egg production. Under option A, gauge size changes, season closures, and trap reductions can all be used independently or in conjunction with one another to achieve that increase in egg production. Under option B, only gauge size changes and season closures can be used, so this means trap reductions cannot be used. And then under option C, gauge size changes can be used, but trap reductions and season closures can only be used in a limited fashion, and they must be used in conjunction with gauge size changes.
All right, so you heard Megan. You basically got 3 options here. Do I have a motion? Mark Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move that under issue 2, management tools, the board adopt option A, management tools can be used independently.
Is there a second? Seconded by Sarah. Discussion. Any discussion? Pat.
I would just caution the board. I know this is tools in the toolbox, but gauge size increases and the continuation of expanding the gauge size differences between the Gulf of Maine and these areas continues to create additional market problems. And I think we're starting to tread on issues of Commerce Clause.
Any other comments? Pete?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This wouldn't be my preferred option, but it does give some flexibility to the industry, and so I guess I would say that the backstop is that the technical committee is going to be looking at whatever the LCMTs come up with to attain the egg production goal. In the event that trap productions are used, we're not against giving credit for it, but it's going to be up to the technical committee to tease out what the active effort is that's going to add up to this 5% or whatever measures that they use for trap production. So keep that in mind. I think that we can't. I don't want us to be in a position in the federal government of getting a proposal from the LCMTs that we can't implement. And I think if these trap productions aren't shown to be active and permanent, then that might be a non-starter for us. And the other thing too is something that that I haven't brought up yet today, but with trap transferability, over the first 2 years of our trap cuts, due to the trap transfer program, 30% of those traps have been reactivated and put into the water. So I want the LCMTs to keep that in mind when they're going back if they use trap productions as a way to achieve these egg production goals. Thank you.
Yeah, Peter, one observation, the interesting thing about that statistic is 70% have not. Dan?
Just a point of clarification relative to this and the previous motion that passed. What would be the deadline for implementation of the new rules?
Megan?
It's kind of up to the board. So we need to set a date in hopefully sometime in June when LCMTs would send final proposals to the commission so that we can get those reviewed by the TC in time for the August board meeting. At that point, at the August board meeting, the board would review and hopefully approve those LCMT proposals. And in August, we'll have to set an implementation deadline for the states. So that's for you guys. Yeah.
Further discussion on this? The suggestion is to, or the motion is to adopt option A. Tom Foti.
Following up on Pat Culler's question about basically importing lobsters, I really like the law enforcement committee to take a look at this because we need lobsters in New Jersey. If the only place we can get them is Maine, we have to look at the gauge size. And there's been a lot of talk about that going on, so I wish we could run that by the law enforcement committee. Because years ago when we looked at it, we says no, create all kinds of problems, but we need to be able to adapt to that situation.
Okay, any other discussion? You ready for the question? All those in favor of the motion, raise your right hand. Ten in favor, opposed? No opposition, no null votes? No null votes. Any abstentions? One abstention. Motion carries. Okay, so we're through the bulk of the issues. Now we need to deal with closed season. And as I indicated before, the option, which option is this, Megan? Which one? 3, 4. Option 4 is very analogous to the request by Area 4. So I'd like Megan to kind of flesh out both issues, and then I'm going to afford an opportunity for Area 4 or 5 to, or 6 for that matter, to offer any comments. And then I think we need to deal with this, but I also think we need to have consistent regulations in place. So Megan.
So the question here is, how should season closures be implemented? And this is prompted by the fact that lobster is now jointly managed with Jonah crab. So the answers to this question would pertain if a LCMT comes back with a proposal that includes a season closure. Under option A, lobster traps must be removed from the water. Under option B, lobster traps could stay in the water, but there would be no possession of lobsters while fishing. And then under option C, traps again could stay in the water. There would be no possession of lobsters for lobster permit holders, but those who fish under the non-trap bycatch limit would be allowed to continue under that bycatch limit, which is 100 lobsters per day up to 500 lobsters per trip. You also notice that there are sub-options under each of these, which asks whether the most restrictive rule applies. And that would be for if a fisherman is permitted to fish in 2 areas, and if both of those areas implement a season closure, whether that fisherman would have to abide by both season closures or just one. As the chairman alluded to, Area 4 did submit a letter that was included in your meeting materials that highlighted some of the discrepancies between state and federal regulations in regard to their current LCMA 4 closure. That was a result of Addendum 17. Some of those inconsistencies are with the application of the most restrictive rule, so that it is applied in state waters. That was not applied in federal waters for season closures. We also have an inconsistency with regards to traps out of the water. In state waters, if the trap is permitted to fish for another species, it can stay in the water. However, in federal waters, all lobster traps have to be removed from the water. We can look at some of the motions that the board made in 2012 to try and reconsider some of those, but I just wanted to kind of foreshadow those issues so that we can hopefully come up with a consistent method for the implementation of season closures.
Questions? Any questions? Someone in area 4, 5, and 6 want to comment on this? Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we've had a lot of public comment on this, a lot of confusion with the federal regulations and with our state regulations. Our lobster harvesters, they really want to be able to harvest Jonah crab during these close lobster seasons. Obviously, that would be option B, the no possessions of lobsters while fishing. Also, in New Jersey, there's the 2 areas, Area 4 and Area 5, and their season closures are different. And there are some lobster harvesters that do possess both those permits for those areas. And obviously, we favor that sub-option 2. The most restrictive rule does not apply. But again, as I mentioned earlier, removing these traps from the water is just putting them out of business. Thank you.
So, Tom, just so I'm clear, of the options in issue 4, which of those would you prefer? If you had your personal preference for an option to put in the addendum and also solve your problems, which of those options would you prefer?
I would make a motion, and when that's appropriate.
Let me take a few more.
But I would favor option B, sub-option Roman numeral 2.
Oh, okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Any other comments, Mike?
Yeah, I'll just add to what was already said. I think we've heard option A is just not reasonable. It's not reasonable to expect the amount of effort that has to go into removing the traps. We heard from stakeholders earlier that shouldn't be a consideration. I also, looking at option C, I think it would be tough for me going back home and telling lobster permit holders that they can't have lobster, but somebody else that's dragging a bottom trawl or using conch pots or somebody else is able to harvest lobster. So I would support where Tom was going with option B, sub option 2.
All right. So I have Megan, Richie, and then Mark.
So I just wanted to quickly provide some food for thought for the board. If we could go to the next slide, please. So there are a couple things that we need to think about, or these are some of the questions that the board needs to answer in regards to this. So some of these things I want to point out. There is the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team rule that prohibits the wet storage of gear for more than 30 days. So I did want to point that out. That is something the board needs to consider here. Also, the other thing I wanted to point out was that kind of the note at the bottom that this is not from the Law Enforcement Committee, this is just from staff discussions, but that there may be some enforcement challenges for dual permit holders if traps can stay in the water and the most restrictive rule does not apply. It might be hard to tell which area those lobsters are coming from if someone is permitted for 2 areas, only one of them has a closure. So I just wanted to, food for thought.
Richie, then Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just thinking, and I'm not knowledgeable on the fishery in that area, but I was assuming, which may be incorrect, that there's a depth that these lobsters maintain. And would it be possible to have, if that's correct, would it be possible to have, instead of taking them out of the water, bring them into shallow water if there are no lobsters there, and so they're stored, you don't have the problem of not able to take them out of the water, but take them where there are no lobsters, if that would be an option, I don't know.
Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Long Island Sound already has a season, and option B, sub-option B, is the most consistent with the present rules that we have.
Okay, thank you. Other comments, suggestions? Pete Burns, and then I'm going to go back to Tom for a motion.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm familiar with the Area 4 issue. We've spoken to quite a few Area 4 fishermen during the course of this closure and beforehand, and also with Tom's staff in New Jersey about this. We had implemented the closure based on what was in the addendum to have the traps taken out of the water. I think that a lot of that was based on, and I'd have to go back to the minutes of the meeting, but I think that the board decided to go that way because there was a technical committee document that said that leaving the traps in the water could still, still be catching lobsters, and it could cause mortality because of the handling pressure and all that. So, I'd like to, however we move forward, I'd like to ensure that we work closely with the states so that everyone's clear on what the federal regulations say and what the state regulations say. I think that that's really important. But I think our preferred alternative here would be two. So that would be traps are removed, but they can fish in other areas during the closure, and that's been another inconsistency with what has happened between ours and the state regulations. If we went forward with something that allowed traps to stay in the water, I think it would be good to get some clarification from the technical committee about how much less conservation or what the difference in the conservation or other concerns there would be regarding that. Thank you.
Tom, motion, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to approve option B, sub-option Roman numeral 2 for issue 4. And just a second here.
All right, is there a second? Mike? Tom, are you finished with
Does that capture the... Do you need me to put more wording in there, or does that capture?
No. Excuse me. I keep turning my microphone off. Probably a worthwhile exercise. Is there a second of the motion? Second? Anyone? Second? Mike, discussion on the motion. We've already had some of the discussion. Tom?
Just, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just another issue for basically keeping these pots in the water. At the public hearings, several lobster harvesters commented that as soon as they take these pots out of the water, the mobile fishing fleet will come in and just take advantage of the pots not being there. So the pots over these years have been basically, I don't even want to use the term artificial reef, but providing habitat and protecting the bottom. So, and even a comment was made by a lobster harvester that does have a mobile gear permit, and he says, I can't wait for these pots to come out so I can go in and start dragging. So there's a lot of concern that the mobile gear will cause more mortality when they come in after those pots are removed, and more mortality on the on the lobster population there. Thank you.
Pete Burns.
So I think it comes down to enforcement. So I think I would ask Tom to, I don't know what level of enforcement the states are doing down there. I know our NOAA fisheries agents have been out there and trying to understand what the regulations are and trying to enforce that. But I think allowing these traps to stay in the water is going to require that we've got a strong enforcement presence to ensure that no lobsters are being harvested. When you got a closure, with no traps in the water. It's a lot easier than when you have traps in the water. So I just thought maybe Tom could address that. Thank you.
Megan?
So just to clarify the motion in the addendum, it's sub option B. So if we could just have Tom, you're okay clarifying that? Thank you.
Steve Train.
As a fisherman, I like this motion. I don't fish there, of course, but I have one problem with it. I don't think there's any problem with enforcing the no possession of lobsters. To say that that's hard to enforce would be saying it's hard to enforce oversized, undersized, or V-tails. All you got to do is go on the boat and see a lobster. So I don't think that's a problem. But I think it's intended for people that are going to be fishing on Jonah crab or something else. I don't want to support this motion if it's intended for wet storage during the closed period.
Tom.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I'll go 1, 2. So I can't speak a lot for enforcement. I think they're having their own committee meeting right now. I know the division has a contract with a builder up in, I believe, Maine for a larger ocean-going vessel, enforcement vessel. They are deputized by the NOAA OLE, so they do some enforcement. I'm aware of the enforcement more in the fall for the large whale take reduction issues and proper line and break points in the line. But that's as much as I can offer for enforcement for Mr. Train. As far as this is to be able to harvest Jonah crab, to be able to fish for something.
I've got Dan and then Mark Alexander. Dan.
Yeah, that's good to hear, and I want to reinforce Steve Train's comments that with the 30-day requirement to haul the gear, clearly this can't be an option for wet storage. It has to be to accommodate the Jonah crab fishery.
Mark.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out in Long Island Sound, I said this is consistent with our present rules, and the reason for that is not because of the Jonah crab fishery, but because of the whelk fishery. We made that accommodation years ago when the season was implemented. That rule has been working pretty good for us, and I'd certainly like to see it maintained. Thank you.
Peter.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I guess so. I have a question now. So it seems like this would be, if this passed, this would take effect for any future closures that are considered under Addendum 25. But that leaves the question of what happens to the current closure that's happening in Area 4 and Area 5, and whether or not this would change that. I guess I'm assuming that if this went forward and the LCMTs decided to look at seasonal closures as part of their 5% egg production goal, that they could use the existing closures or somehow amend the current closures and include something else to achieve the goals under Addendum 25, but they would somehow there would still have to be a justification that they meet the 10% decrease in exploitation that was required when that closure initially went in place. Am I right in am I right in assuming that?
Megan, you want to comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, you're correct that this motion only applies for future season closures that might be implemented as a result of this. So to address the Area 4 issue, that's our next item on the agenda. So we would be looking for motions to reconsider previous motions to amend or change that issue should the board like to do that.
I guess my question, and I ask out of ignorance, is let's, for the question, assume that this motion passes. Do the states have the right under conservation equivalency to submit alternative proposals to change the existing plans that have been implemented? And if the answer is yes, then I would suggest they take advantage of that. Megan? Or Tony?
I think the board would have to you should make a decision of whether or not conservation equivalency can apply to the most restrictive rule or not. I need to do a quick check of the FMP, but I believe in the past I'm not sure if the most restrictive rule is a coast-wide measure, then those do not apply to to the conservation equivalency issues.
All right, so I guess my question may be step off the edge of the world here. So let's deal with the motion on the table. If the motion passes, then we'll go back to the issue of how we revise the process we use to revise the existing regs. My whole purpose in combining these two was to have a consistent policy that would apply to addendum 25 and any of the season closures. I think we don't need two different policies on those. So let's deal with the motion. You ready for the vote on the motion? All right. I see no hands up. All those in favor of the motion on the board, please signify by raising your hand. 11 in favor. Any no votes? No votes. Any abstentions? Any null votes? Motion carries. Okay, so let's go back to the point that was just raised, and maybe I'll get Tony. Tony, why don't you just come over here for a minute? What is your preference for a process to modify the existing regulations? I think it's highly desirable to have all of these regulations be consistent.
Yep. And so before, I want to clarify, when I was talking about whether or not conservation equivalency could apply, I think you can apply the conservation equivalency to the number of days that the closure needs to be or the time period, but it's that I don't think that you can apply conservation equivalency to the traps in or out of the water part or the most restrictive rule part. You would have to pick one and stick with that. In terms of if this can apply to the previous actions of the board, I guess that's the will of the chairman. If you want it to and no one disagrees, then that would work. But in order to change an action that we previously agreed to, we would need a 2/3 majority vote to make that change. So if it was unanimous, then that would.
Okay, so with that guidance, and that was helpful, let me suggest this, that rather than dealing, if it's acceptable to the areas most affected, let me suggest that between now and the next meeting, the states that are negatively affected by this submit proposals, written proposals, and I'd ask you to try to consolidate it into a single proposal on a way to handle this that is consistent with the motion that just passed, and we'll add it to the agenda for the next board meeting. And if the consensus is that they want to accept that, then we'll have to go through the process that Tony just articulated, which is to reconsider the motion. Does that sound fair enough to the states most negatively affected by this? I'm not trying to postpone this. I'm just thinking we're already over our time limit. We've got other issues we have to deal with, and unless this is a matter of urgency that needs to be resolved today, that gives us a timeline and a process to do it. Any objections to doing that? Okay, so the states most negatively affected, please get together and craft a proposal and submit it for consideration at the next board meeting. Any objections? No objections. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next agenda item, which is inconsistencies in federal regulations. Megan?
So we kind of just talked about one of them, but there's one other that we need to wrap up here, and that is in regards to Addenda 21 and 22. So just to refresh the board on what happened in those addenda, we have active trap cap, and that's the number of traps that can be fished. And then we have an individual ownership cap. That's the number of traps someone could own. And you'll notice that that individual cap is higher than the active cap, and this allows for trap banking. And the intent of these addenda were to modify the trap transfer program to address latent effort and scale the Southern New England fishery to the diminished size of the resource. In July 2016, NOAA suspended their rulemaking process for federal trap caps and banking, and this was due to uncertainty surrounding the board's response to the Southern New England stock condition, as well as concern that trap caps and banking could encourage fishermen to invest significant funds in a fishery, which could be severely restricted in the future. In October, the board agreed to revisit the issue after action on Addendum 25. We have now taken that action, and so the question before the board is, would the board like to provide a recommendation to NOAA regarding implementation of Addenda 21 and 22?
I'm sorry, I was listening to talking to Tony, but we had industry recommendations on this, and just I'm probably repeating what you just said, Megan. My understanding is both the Area 2 industry and the Area 3 industry both recommended that the board forward a recommendation to NOAA to implement these provisions. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Okay. So comments on the issue, questions? In other words, the recommendation from the industry, and having been part of some of those discussions both at public hearings, one of the concerns that came up at a couple of different meetings was the lack of action, federal action on this is allowing individuals, particularly in Area 3, to increase the number of traps they're fishing, which is, I think, counter to the whole strategy. In other words, when the strategy was put in place, the assumption was that after X number of years, we would be at 1540, I think, was the number. Is that correct? 1548. Yeah, 1548, and because of the delay, we had I had Heidi, who works with me, go through the NOAA database, and I think there are 27 vessels that have increased above, or 17 maybe, one of those two numbers, that have increased their trap cap above the cap that was proposed. So actually more effort is coming into the fishery because of the lack of action on this. So my recommendation is for somebody to make a motion to reiterate our position and basically recommend to NOAA that they institute the proposal as provided for in the various addendum. Comments on that? Adam?
So just procedurally, before, I wasn't prepared to make a motion on that, but with this comment agreed to revisit the issue after action. Do we want to have this discussion? Is it relevant before we take the roll call vote on final action on Addendum 25, or should we have that final action first before we move into this issue?
I'm actually glad you asked that, because Tony, the discussion I was having with Tony there was whether or not we actually need to take final action here. You know, I mean, there's kind of two ways forward with this addendum. The intent is to tasked the LCMTs now and the states to basically put together plans consistent with the provisions that we've adopted. But we could take that final vote at the next meeting. In other words, there wouldn't be anything lost. And I'd ask Tony to speak to this directly. I mean, if the staff is recommending we take a final vote, I'll put it to a final vote. I'm not trying to avoid that, but if we can do that at the next meeting, that's also fine with me. So Tony, what's your guidance?
David, as you just described, that you can go down two paths. So if we wait to approve it in August, then what we're essentially doing is including the LCMT plans or proposals, or after you approve them, as part of the document itself. And so those will be solidified into the document. If you wait, if you approve the document today, then the LCMT plans would not become part of the document, and they would just be side proposals down the line. So it's up to the board of how you, or the chair.
So, and this follows up on Adam's point, if we want the LCMT proposals to be integrated into the addendum, and what would happen there is they would, the process would be, they would prepare their plans, the plans would undergo a technical analysis, and then we would vote on those plans and finalize the addendum at the next meeting. In other words, we set all the rules for the addendum, but we haven't allowed the LCMTs. So is there a preference around the table? Either path works. It's a question of what your preference is. Adam?
Well, since you asked for a preference, I'll state mine, and that's to take final action today. Given the debate we had around the table, the very contentious discussions, I think we need to walk out of here and say we did what we did and it's done.
Dan?
I respect Adam's view on that, but for posterity and for transparency in long-term documentation, it seems like we're better off having a document that captures the actions. But I can go either way.
All right, any other comments, Mike? I'm going to ask for a motion.
Just another thing to keep in mind regarding a reconsideration of any of the actions we took today. Because this is a continuation of yesterday's meeting, any actions that would be up for reconsideration would require a 2/3 majority vote, and the person making that motion would have been on the prevailing side. If we get to August, all of those rules don't apply. So it's just another thing to keep in mind for the board in moving forward. I can go either way as well today.
Bob?
Actually, since this is at the same meeting, if somebody from the prevailing side of a motion that's potentially reconsidered, that only takes a simple majority during this current meeting if somebody from the prevailing side reintroduces that. But if you go to the next meeting, that's when it takes a 2/3 vote to amend or rescind a previous final action.
Right. Let me try this to try to accelerate this. I know people hate doing this. Let me just see a show of hands from each delegation on whether or not they want to vote on to finalize this today or put it off until the next meeting. All those in favor of voting on it today, please raise your hand. One person. All those opposed? All right, let me restate that. All those in favor of voting on it, finalizing it next meeting, raise your hand. So you got 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we don't have a really convincing majority on either side. Somebody want to make a motion here? Adam?
I'll make the motion to approve Addendum 25 with the options included today.
Do I have a second? Is there a second? Motion dies due to a lack of second. Someone want to make a motion to propose final action, approve final action at the next board meeting? Dan?
I move that we propose final action for the next board meeting on Addendum 25.
Is there a second? Seconded by Mark Gifton. Discussion. Megan, did you want to make a point on that?
I'm not sure we really need a motion for that. I think we can just say we'll take action. Roll call vote in August, if people are comfortable with that.
Pete Burns.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a question. So what happens if the LCMTs, for some reason, can't come back with proposals that meet the 5% goal after the technical committee has reviewed those? What happens at the August meeting?
Yeah, good question. Tony, do you want to take a shot at that? I think the head of the table is beginning to get worn out.
I'll save Tony from moving seats here. You know, the LCMTs are advisory to the board. If the A can't come up with an option, then the board has the authority and responsibility to come up with those measures.
Megan.
And I will add, in the addendum, it does say that if we don't receive an LCMT proposal, the states with fishermen in that LCMT decide the management actions. So there is a bit of a backstop there.
Okay, so we don't need a motion on this, according to the staff. Final approval will take place at the next meeting of the board. Okay, so what other issues do we need today?
We still have the question before the board of whether someone would like to make a motion to provide a recommendation to NOAA regarding implementation of Addenda 21 and 22.
Anyone care to make that as a motion? Dan.
I'll make a motion to forward to NOAA a recommendation to adopt addendums 21 and 22.
Fully adopt.
Fully adopt. Thank you, David.
Is there a second? Seconded by Doug Rout. Bob Beal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just another technicality. I think this is to recommend to the policy board to send a letter off to NOAA Fisheries.
Good point. Any objections to that perfection, Dan? Okay. So it's a motion to recommend to the policy board to forward a recommendation to NOAA requesting full implementation of addendum 21 and 22. Who was the second? The second on the motion was Doug Rowe. Okay, Pete Burns on the motion, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of course, I'm going to abstain on this because it's a recommendation to the service, but I would just recommend, you know, a lot of things have changed now since those addenda were initially put in place, and you know, now we have an idea of where addendum 25 is going to lead us with respect to how we're going to handle southern New England moving forward. But I think it would be helpful to us, rather than just forwarding those addenda as they were approved and sending them back to us, and I don't know, then we'd have to sort of tease through a bunch of different issues. It might be a good idea to either have the LCMTs or the PDT, somebody maybe take a look at those options, see what makes sense now, see how they need to be, how the board would want to recommend those be applied to the current state of the fishery and the management process that we have in place. I think that will help us to fully consider those in a more comprehensive way. Thank you.
Okay, so you have a motion on the board and a second. Any other discussion on this? You ready for the question? All in favor, raise your right hand. 10 in favor, noes? No noes. Any abstentions? One abstention. Any null votes? No null votes. Motion passes. Any other business to come before the committee? If not, Tom, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this is really just a request for the board to send to the policy board to request the law enforcement committee to analyze the feasibility of legal-sized lobsters from LCMA 1 and 6 to be shipped and sold throughout the other states with conflicting possessions and size limits. And that's just a request from this board to the policy board.
Tony, did you want to comment on this?
So, Tom, are you just asking the Law Enforcement Committee to comment on the enforceability or to clarify where there would be enforcement loopholes? What are you asking the Law Enforcement Committee to specifically analyze?
Well, first, if it's feasible, if it's doable, and then obviously if it is enforceable, yes.
So under the commission rules, it is allowed. Possession laws are only for harvesters. It's what you bring from water to land, for what we put in our FMP. For what the dealers have, our FMP regulations do not apply. Some states do apply it that way because of loopholes in possession, and they do it to make it streamlined. Now, not all states do that. There are other ways to look at that. Massachusetts is an example of a state that doesn't have that possession law apply all the way around the board. So I just want to clarify what exactly it is law enforcement is analyzing.
Tom or Adam?
So thank you. As chairman of the next board, I'm probably even more sensitive to time right now than you are. But if I could ask Greg DiDomenico to come to a microphone just very briefly to specify what the issue is so we can get direction on how we can get this addressed in our state.
Greg was last seen running, screaming from the meeting room. Greg, would like to come up?
I was trying to run and scream as quietly as possible. Sorry you noticed. I'm going to make this short and sweet. I understand everybody's running out of patience and time this morning, so I'll try to do my best. The reason that we're bringing this issue up today and asking the board to take action to ask the Law Enforcement Committee to analyze and weigh on this issue is pretty simple. Right now, this is a New Jersey problem. So I understand not every state has the same situation we do, but heard some testimony today that I really compelled me to push on this issue, and that is the board, in the way that management of Lobster has continued, is gauge increases. And as gauge increases continue, it exacerbates the problem of trade between states. And eventually it's going to have an impact on the fishermen and the price and their ability to sell lobsters. And that is certainly under your purview. So I think it would be extremely helpful if the Law Enforcement Committee took a look at this issue and made some finding and compelled other states, including certainly ours, to address this issue and allow the shipping and sale of undersized lobsters or lobsters that have conflicting size and possession limits in other states. And I know it's a complicated topic, but I see it very simple in the sense that we're making a legally caught product illegal in other states through different regs. And that is a commission issue. And if the law enforcement folks weighed in heavily or weighed in support of this, it would make it much easier for people in our state to continue this business within the state of New Jersey, importing lobsters from areas like Maine and Massachusetts in and out of our state. And so I just see this as a very simple issue that is in the commission's purview, and would really appreciate moving this to the Law Enforcement Committee for their assistance. Thank you very much.
Pat Kelleher. Thanks, Greg.
So Tony clearly laid this out from an FMP standpoint. What we are putting in place is in regards to harvester and a possession limit from a harvester standpoint. States then have different rules as they relate to the possession by a dealer or dealers. And so what the Law Enforcement Committee needs to look at is simply chain of custody. Can rules be put in place that allow a chain of custody so when it does transfer, that product transfers from a harvester to a dealer, that it's now not an illegal product? And we do it in Maine, Connecticut does it, I mean other states are doing it. It can be done and it needs to be resolved. Dealers in Maine clearly laid out to me that they're considering Commerce Clause lawsuits against states because of the lack of ability to move millions of pounds of product. And so some clarity on chain of custody I think is very important.
All right, so let me make this suggestion, and I know we got a couple of other people that want to speak to this, but we're really running out of time. Let me suggest we get, between now and the next meeting, we get any input. Renee has heard the discussion. We get a record of this. We get any input that the Enforcement Committee would like to offer on this, any guidance that they would like to offer, and we formally schedule this for discussion on the next agenda. That way we'll have enforcement input, and any of the states can think about this and bring whatever recommendations back to us at that meeting and allow enough time to actually delve into the details. It's a little bit more complicated than we have time for. Richie.
And added to that, existing state regulations, so we understand, you know, what the lay of the land is now presently.
I mean, I just echo what Pat said. I mean, Massachusetts and a number of the states have dealt with this. And so as part of that dialogue, they can bring their regulations back and basically say, this is the way we handle the problem, and we'll have a more comprehensive discussion. So anybody object to that? If not, the staff will schedule that. And I guess we're under other business, are we? Yeah. Any other business to come before the committee? If not, thank you very much. Meeting adjourned.
We'll start the TTOG board as soon as possible, but 10 minutes, promptly 10 minutes.